You know, we've got a great Memorial Day in this country, and it's called Independence Day, July the 4th. Now, this also points back to something that happened in the past. Is that not true? It points back. Now, suppose somebody came along and wanted to change Independence Day. Someone comes and says, look, we don't like July the 4th. Let's make July the 5th Independence Day. Well, now, can you do that, friends? You can call July 5th Independence Day if you want to. But that doesn't make it Independence Day, does it? Why? Because the Declaration of Independence was signed on July the 4th, 1776. And that's where it
Memorial days and birthdays always point back to an event of the past. In today's crusade message, Joe Cruz highlights one of the most important memorials of history. Stay tuned for The Amazing Facts.
Here in these meetings, we've had quite a bit to say about doctrine as well as the great fundamental truths of salvation. Now, friends, these two things go together like hand in glove. We could never say enough about the love of Jesus and how He came down to this world to give His life as an atoning sacrifice for man. And yet, on the other hand, we must not neglect doctrine either, because that's the skeleton part of our religious life. You see, those spiritual truths about Christ's birth, His holy life, His death, resurrection, and ascension, this is the flesh and blood part of our Christian experience. And the doctrines constitute the skeleton part of our religious life. Now, there's always a danger, of course, when we're talking a lot about doctrine, and that is that we might leave Jesus out of it. But we've not done that here in the Amazing Facts Crusade. No, we've put Him in the very heart and center and circumference of every doctrine, every prophecy, every teaching that we've been bringing forth. We talked about the second coming of Jesus already. We talked about His justification gift and about His imparted righteousness. And now tonight we're brought to this subject of God's great test of loyalty, His Sabbath. And you know, friends, if Jesus had nothing to say about this subject tonight, we could stop right here and I could forget it and send you home and you wouldn't miss a thing. But I'm glad to tell you that Jesus did have a lot to do with it and a lot to say about it. And I make no apologies tonight as I introduce this subject of God's great test of loyalty, the Sabbath Christ gave the world. Now, I've heard some people say, well, you know, there's not any real special day, no holy day, no Sabbath day at all. The days are all alike, and God sees it that way, and we don't have to worry about any kind of a holy day or a Sabbath. Let's turn in our first text tonight from Revelation chapter 1. And I want you to see, friends, that in God's sight there is one day that is very different from all the others and that is very, very special. Revelation chapter 1, and I'm going to read verse 10. Very, very interesting words. John writes, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day and heard behind me a great voice as of a trumpet. Now notice something here. John said, I had a vision on a certain day, and he calls it the Lord's Day. Now he doesn't tell what day it was. He just says it was the Lord's Day. And do you know something? This little phrase, the Lord's Day, is not found anywhere else in the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. So by simply reading this one verse, we don't know what day he was talking about. We just simply know that there was one certain day that he had a vision on that day. And he wrote it down here. But, friends, it's called the Lord's Day. Now, that indicates that there must be something special about it, right? Something special, because it's called the Lord's Day. Can we find out from the Bible and other verses of the Bible just what day John was talking about when he said he had this vision? I think so. Come back with me to Matthew 12, and we're going to look at verse 8. Matthew 12, verse 8, Jesus Himself is speaking here. And He says, for the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. Now get this. If Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath day, then the Sabbath must be the Lord's day. Isn't that right? If the English language has any meaning at all, that's exactly what it's saying. And do you know something, friends? The commandment itself that was written by the very hand of God says, the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord. So even there, it's called the Lord's Day, the Sabbath of the Lord. And then you come down to Isaiah 58, verse 13, and God says, the Sabbath, my holy day. In fact, that's the only day that God ever calls my day. He claims it as His own. So you see now why John said that he was in the Spirit on the Lord's day? That's the Sabbath that he had that special vision on. Now you may wonder and say, well, now why does God claim this day, the Sabbath, as His own in a very special way? And why does He designate it my day and the Lord's day? I'll tell you why, friends. Because Jesus made it in the beginning. Did you know that? Now a lot of people don't understand this. And there may be some puzzled looks out there right now. You're saying, Brother Joe, I thought God the Father was the great creator God who made everything in the world. No, friends, the Bible says that Jesus was the creator. Did you know that? Of course, Jesus is God too. We know that. But let's go in the Bible now to John chapter 1, and I want to read you these words very clearly because many people don't understand this biblical principle. John 1, verses 1 to 3. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. Now notice that somebody was back there in the beginning with God. And it says that His name was the Word. You see, that's actually what He was called. That was His name. And it says He was in the beginning with God. And the next verse says, verse 3, all things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. Now let me ask you something, friends. Who was this Word that was back in the beginning with God who made everything that was made? Well, you just come down to verse 12 or 14 rather, and it tells us, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld His glory. The glory is of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Who is that? Why, that's Jesus, friends. Christ was that Word who was with the Father in the beginning and who made everything that was made. Now, there are many other texts in the New Testament that say the very same thing. But let's go to Hebrews chapter 1 and read another one that is just as clear and specific as this one we just referred to. In Hebrews 1, verses 1 to 3. God, who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in times past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by His Son, whom He hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also He made the worlds. Now notice it says it was by the Son, by Jesus, that God made everything that was made. In other words, Christ was the divine agent of creation by which everything was brought into existence. He's the one who spoke and caused matter to suddenly appear out of nothing. He did not create this world and this universe, friends, out of pre-existent material. God had the power to speak. Christ had the power to speak and cause things to suddenly appear out of nothing. And so the world was made, it says here. In fact, the worlds, plural, were made by Jesus. God did it through the Son. And so when we go back to the book of Genesis here and read about those first 6 days of time, in which something was made each day. You remember, light was made there on the first day, and then matter began to appear, one thing after another, the trees, the plants, and so forth. And then on the 6th day, you remember, that great masterpiece of creation, the animals were made, and then God made man. Adam and Eve were created on that 6th day. And then, following that climactic event, came the 7th day, and we read this now beginning in Genesis 2, verses 1 to 3. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the 7th day God ended His work which He had made, and He rested on the 7th day from all His work which He had made, and God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because that in it He had rested from all His work which God created and made. Now notice He did all of the work on 6 days. And then on the 7th day, He did 3 things that were totally different from anything He had ever done before on the other days. It says He rested on that day. He didn't do any work at all. And He blessed it, and He hallowed it, and He sanctified it. You see, all of those things were done on this 7th day. And by the way, who is doing this now? Who is the Creator? Who did we find out the Creator was? Why, that's Jesus, friends. Christ is that Creator. This is the reason I love to preach about the Sabbath, friends, because you can't separate it from Jesus. He made it there in the beginning. And you find Him related to that Sabbath from Genesis to Revelation. And that's why I love to preach about the Sabbath, because Jesus made it. That's why it's called the Lord's Day. Now, friends, after we found out who made the Sabbath, and by the way, some people tell me, I've heard them say this over and over again, well, you know, that was done way back there in the Old Testament. That Sabbath doesn't have anything to do with us. Because, you know, it was made long, long ago for a certain period of time and for certain people, and so it doesn't apply to us today. Friends, that is not true. They even say it's a shadow. Have you ever heard anybody say that the Sabbath is a shadow and therefore it doesn't really apply today? That just isn't true. Let me tell you why it's not true, friends. It could never be true. You see, shadows did not exist before sin existed. You can't have a shadow before sin existed. No way. Certain things like the animal sacrifices came along as a shadow, pointing forward to the deliverance from sin. But if there had not been sin, there wouldn't have been any animal sacrifices. There wouldn't have been any of those types and shadows at all. You see, friends, the Sabbath was made in the beginning before sin existed. And therefore, you can never say that the Sabbath is a shadow of anything. Many other things were added as shadows after sin came in, but the Sabbath was made in the beginning in the Garden of Eden when everything was absolutely perfect and there was no possible way for it to be considered a shadow. Now, let's ask another question, friends. We found out who made it. Jesus made it, didn't He? Who did He make it for? That's the next question. For whom was the Sabbath made? Now let's go to the book of Mark, chapter 2 and verse 28, and let Jesus answer this question for us. Mark 2:28, Jesus said unto them, well, verse 27, let's read that first. And He said unto them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. Now, friends, who was the only man here when Jesus made it? Why, Adam and Eve had been made on the sixth day, isn't that right? And then He made the Sabbath the next day and blessed it and sanctified it. And Jesus Himself said, I made it for man. And by the way, that word man is used in the generic sense. That means that it includes all the world of mankind. That's the way the word is used. And the only man here and the only woman here was Adam and Eve, who had been made on the sixth day. And Jesus said, I made it for man. Well, He made it for them, and He made it for all of their descendants who would come after them. Have you ever heard anybody say, well, you know, that was made for the Jews? The old Jewish Sabbath. How many of you have ever heard anybody say the old Jewish Sabbath? Ah, friends, let me tell you something. Nowhere do you find in the Bible that expression. It doesn't say the Sabbath of the Jews. It says always the Sabbath of the Lord. The Sabbath of the Lord. There weren't any Jews in existence when the Sabbath was made. In fact, it would be 2,000 years practically before any Jews would even come on the stage of history. Do you think Christ made it back there for the Jews and put it aside for 2,000 years, and then later on when they came on the scene said, here's something I made for you? Oh no, friends. It's not made for the Jews at all. It's made for man. It's made for man. And that means all mankind. In fact, friends, there were two wonderful divine institutions that were made by Jesus back in the Garden of Eden before sin came in. And both of them were made for man. One of those institutions was marriage, and the other was the Sabbath. Now, the Bible says that woman was made for man. Remember that text? Woman was made for man. The very same term there, the generic word for all humanity. That's the word that's used there when it says woman was made for man. And then Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man. Let me tell you something. If the Sabbath is only for the Jews, then marriage is only for the Jews. That's what we'd have to conclude, because the same word is used for both of them. And friends, Christ made these two wonderful holy institutions right back in the beginning before there was any sin, and gave those two institutions to man. Now listen, Luke was not a Jew. He was a Gentile. And he wrote two books of the Bible. He wrote the book of Acts and he wrote the Gospel of Luke. Now because he was not Jewish, Luke had a way of referring to Jewish things in a very particular manner and pointing them out and reminding people of that. And so you'll find him using these terms over and over again: the synagogue of the Jews, the Passover of the Jews, and this and that of the Jews. But he never said the Sabbath of the Jews. Never. Because it is not the Sabbath of the Jews, my friends. The Sabbath was made for man, and that includes everybody, all mankind. Now, we found out who made it. Jesus made it. We found out who he made it for. He made it for everybody, including all mankind. The next question is this: why did he make it? Why did he make the Sabbath? Now let's go right to the commandment itself in Exodus 20, and we will find the reason for the creation of the Sabbath. In Exodus 20, verse 8, we find these words written right into the very heart of the great law of God. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Now this tells us that God made this day as a memorial of creation. In other words, it was to remind men everywhere as to who the great divine creator was. Jesus made it. God made it. And so he said, you keep the Sabbath, and that will remind you that I am the only true God, the one who established the heavens and the earth and who spoke all matter into existence. And you will know then that I'm the only true God, the only one to be worshiped. Why, friends, in other words, what I'm saying is that this is the birthday of the world. It's the birthday of the world. And it points back to an event of the past. It is a memorial of something from the past to be remembered. And let me tell you something, you can't change a memorial, can you? You can't do it. You know, we've got a great Memorial Day in this country, and it's called Independence Day, July the 4th. Now, this also points back to something that happened in the past. Is that not true? It points back. Now, suppose somebody came along and wanted to change Independence Day. Someone comes and says, look, we don't like July the 4th. Let's make July the 5th Independence Day. Well, now, can you do that, friends? You can call July 5th Independence Day if you want to. But that doesn't make it Independence Day, does it? Why? Because the Declaration of Independence was signed on July the 4th, 1776. And that's where it will always remain. The only way that day could ever be changed would be for history to run through again and for that document to be signed on another day. Then that day would be Independence Day. But right now we've got to leave it where it is because it marks an event in past history, and it is a memorial of something that is already finished and we can't change it. It's very much like your birthday. You know, that's an act that has already taken place, hasn't it? Your birth. And all you can do year by year is to acknowledge that fact that you were born on a certain day. And so you remember it as your birthdays roll around. Well, now, the Sabbath is the birthday of the world. And every Sabbath, as it comes to us, it simply reminds us of something that is past, that has already happened. The only way you could change your birthday would be for your life to sort of be lived over again if possible, and you should be born on a different day, and then that would be your birthday. I can't change my birthday. It's on December the 28th, and it's going to stay right there on that day. I cannot change it, my friends, because it was on December 28, 1920. Well, when I was born in that year, that's my birthday. And it's December 28th. That's the point I'm making. It's that day that comes around every year that I can remember as the memorial of the day I was born. And I can't change it. I can't come along and say, well, I like December the 29th better, and so I'll change my birthday. You can't change your birthday. You can't change the birthday of the world either, friends. You can't change the Sabbath. It's fixed, and it's set right there. Now, let me ask you something. Does God's blessing make a difference on something? Does it? Why, friends, when God blessed that day back there and Jesus blessed that day, it made it different. Don't you pray for God to bless your children? You believe that makes a difference? You believe God's blessing makes a difference on something? Of course you do. That's why you pray for God to bless your children. And I'm telling you that that day, that seventh day that God made back there, that Jesus blessed back there, is different. It always will be. Nobody can change or remove the blessing of God. Now, you've noticed, of course, that fourth commandment right in the very heart of the Ten Commandment law of God, and you've seen that it's different from the others. Now, most of the commandments begin with the words, thou shalt not. Isn't that right? Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, and so forth. And yet, here is one in the very center of the law that begins in a different manner. Remember, it says. Remember the Sabbath day. Why is this couched in different language? I'll tell you why, friends. Because it was already there in existence. And God was merely calling their attention to it. He was commanding them to remember something that He had given at the very beginning, that had always been there, but men had forgotten it. Now, isn't it interesting that the very day God said, remember, the world forgot it. And so Jesus had to come along and tell them again. And God had to write it in the very middle of His law and say, remember that day that I made back there, that you are to remember because of my great creative powers. And so the Sabbath is different. It always will be. Now, friends, I'm going to tell you something else that I believe. I believe that not only did Jesus make the Sabbath, I believe that Jesus wrote it in the Ten Commandments. You say, now, Brother Joe, you're going too far now to say that Jesus wrote the Ten Commandments. Well, now let me give you a text or two for my saying that. Come to 1 Corinthians 10 now in the New Testament. 1 Corinthians 10, and we'll read the first 4 verses. Moreover, brethren, I would not that ye should be ignorant, how that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and the sea, and did all eat the same spiritual meat, and did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Oh, say, this verse tells us that Jesus Christ was with the children of Israel as they journeyed through the wilderness. He was the rock that traveled with them through the wilderness. Did you know that? Did you ever read that Christ was there with those Israelites as they passed through the wilderness? Now, please come back with me in the Old Testament to the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah chapter 9, and I'm going to read now verse 13. And when we put this verse with that one over in 1 Corinthians 10, it's very interesting. Thou camest down also upon Mount Sinai, and spakest with them from heaven, and gavest them right judgments and true laws, good statutes and commandments, and madest known unto them thy holy Sabbath, and commandest them precepts, statutes, and laws by the hand of Moses thy servant, and gavest them bread from heaven for their hunger, and broughtest forth water for them out of the rock for their thirst. Now notice, friends, the same one here who gave them the Sabbath gave them the water, it says, from the rock. Now tell me, who was the rock who followed them? Christ was the rock. We just read that over in the New Testament. So if Jesus was the rock who followed them, and Jesus gave them the Sabbath, and Jesus gave them the water, my friends, I say then that Christ must have given them the law. And sure enough, in Isaiah, I believe it's 22:33, says that Jesus, the Lord, was the lawgiver of Israel. So this makes it very clear then, to my mind, that Jesus not only made the Sabbath, but He also commanded the Sabbath. He was right there with them as they traveled, and He gave them that law at Mount Sinai. And so Jesus then is very closely and intimately connected, my friends, with the making of the Sabbath and the giving of the Sabbath of the world. I think that's a good reason for you and me to observe that Sabbath as we go along through life.
My heart can see when I pause to remember a heartache here is but a stepping stone along the trail that's winding always upward. This troubled world is not my final
until the day my eyes behold that city, until the day God calls me home.
The things of earth will dim and lose their value when we recall they're borrowed for a while, and things of earth that cause my heart to tremble, remembering them will only bring a smile. So until then, our hearts must go on singing. Until then, with joy, let's carry on.